Bean Sauce Beans here, and welcome to my video. Ready Player One, Sword Art Online, Jumanji. What do all of these things have in common? That's right, it's that their most recent adaptations are mid. Also, they concern themselves with themes around going to another world. Escapism has always been a very popular form of media for a lot of people. You know, coming home after a long day of work or school and just losing yourself in a book or a movie or a video game, or in your case right now, YouTube, called out. I personally love being immersed in a piece of media. That's why when I saw the announcement of Zenith in 2019, I was really excited. Even though I wasn't a massive fan of Sword Art Online, I found its concept incredibly intriguing when I first watched it in high school. You know, taking that MMO immersion as it already is and then putting it into VR with sort of a proximity chat would really make it come as alive as possible with current technology. This would all make it feel like for a couple of hours before your headset dies that you're actually in a fantasy world with other people. How cool is that? Sadly, I couldn't back the Kickstarter back in 2019 when it launched on account of being diagnosed with being a broke bitch, but I have watched it from a distance since then and have been incredibly interested following its development. Before it was launched this January, the days leading up to the launch of Zenith in early 2022 were incredibly hype-filled. I joined the Discord and sort of just chatted with other people about all the things we were going to do, all the cool new stuff we were going to try, and how cool it would be to do those things. We were all very excited. Now, I'm 25 years old, and that's basically ancient. This is not my first time being around for the early days of a game release. I know that hype can often do way more bad than good. For example, I was incredibly hyped about Elder Scrolls Online, I was incredibly hyped about No Man's Sky, and I was incredibly hyped about ChaoticGame.com. Don't get me wrong, all of those games are excellent now, except Chaotic, rest in peace, my beloved. No Man's Sky has made a famously monumental comeback, and Elder Scrolls Online has sort of gradually improved over time for enough years that now it's actually quite a good game. But at the time of launch, I was understandably disappointed with both of those games. They both had a lot of hype around them and just didn't live up to it. That is all to say that while I was looking forward to Zenith, I was trying to sort of keep my hype realistic. After all, this was basically the first full-scale MMO in VR. I mean, surely it wouldn't be smooth at launch. But you know, other than the day one server issues that every MMO has on launch day, I was wrong. This game was f***ing awesome, okay? You were f***ing throwing lightning bolts and fireballs everywhere. It was f***ing fantastic, okay? Day one, I was having a blast. Day one, I was running around the starting zone with 30 other randos who had no idea what was going on, and we were just screaming on proximity chat every time a monster died, and we were just hyping each other up. The spells are like gesture-based, and the swords are like actually swung, so you actually like had to do all this crazy, you know, flying through the air, bombarding monsters from below. The flying is actually really good. You know, getting repeatedly wiped by creatures that are like way stronger than you, and just going back in with no change in strategy, and having it all happen again with just a bunch of randos. Oh my goodness, it was such a fantastic time. Even just finding like basil or carrots or oranges on the ground and picking those up and like putting them in your inventory and then like making different like food items with them later. Like, it was just all so novel. It was also incredible. It was also fantastic. It was a magical experience. It really was. I want to speak about one experience I had in particular that really stuck out to me. A little later into the first night, I stumbled across a cave entrance that one of the quests I had wanted me to go into. There were like a few other people there that were just sort of at the cave entrance, and they were, I guess, waiting for more people to come along. And so we all just sort of went down together. And you know, we fought the monsters as we went through the cave, and it was all well and good, and they got a little bit harder as you went down further. And then eventually, we got to a spot where the monsters were pretty hard, but we were like managing to do it, but there was another group there too. And that group was like sort of trapped in a room by like a bunch of monsters that they couldn't get past, or they would aggro them and I guess get wiped. So we sort of came up from behind, we like tag teamed those monsters, and then our two groups kind of like joined up. And now we had a party of probably like 15 or 20 people. And just, by the way, I don't know any of these people. These are just complete randos. So we continue like deeper into the mine, and as the mobs get harder and harder, you know, a couple people died, but like we resurrected them. There was like no full team wipes or whatever. And then we got to the boss, and the boss just completely wiped us. And we all respawn, and we sort of like walk back to the cave entrance, and I just sort of like walk in front of the crowd, and I just sort of like improv like a motivational speech, and I like talk about strategy. I don't know anything about the strategy of this game. It came out like a few hours ago. Nobody does, right? I'm like, healers, you gotta heal this group of people, and tanks, you like stay up in the face of the big boss, and you know, everyone else is blah 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 blah. It was just, and then like I sort of went back into the crowd, and someone else came up and like did like a, we could do this, guys, blah blah blah. It was, oh my goodness, it was such a fantastic experience. It was so much fun. We went back down and we fought our way through the dungeon again. We got to the boss and we beat them this time. And it was just such an incredible, we were all cheering, we were all clapping, we were all, I think some people were like dancing on the monster's corpse or whatever. It was just, oh, I cannot stress how fantastic of an experience that was. It's easily like a top 5 just all video game experience for me, and I've played a lot of video games. No, don't worry about that. In the first week or so, I had a few more experiences that were similar to that, primarily in the pirate area. There was a lot of good stuff that happened there with just complete randos. I was absolutely loving Zenith. As the days went on, the initial hype went down and I got farther into the world. I found it to be more sparsely populated, less dense than the starting zone from what I was just talking about. Occasionally you'd see a small group of people running around and doing stuff and you could join up with them before parting ways and doing your own thing. That was always good. But it really did feel kind of like it was dead in a lot of areas. Now, I know it wasn't. The server still had its full population at this time. There were all these little servers that were like region-based, and many of them were full. I was always joining the like super full ones. And if you went back to the starting area, you could see that. There were still people all over that were new, still downloading the game and trying stuff out. In the higher up areas, there were less and less people, which is what you would expect to see. But most MMOs generally get around this issue by having a lot of people in the server, and I understand that Zenith has sort of an extra limitation of having to run on the Quest. You know, VR just sort of inherently being more demanding on computers than a standard flat screen game, so they can't always have, you know, thousands of people in a single server. In fact, I believe they're limited to 100. So I can't blame them necessarily. I'm just saying that it did feel more dead than you would expect an MMO to feel as you progress further, even though as you progress further into the zones of a game, you would expect the population to decrease, especially around the launch time. Now, don't get me wrong, at this point I was still very motivated to play. It was just sort of a different level of motivation. It was less of, oh my goodness, I can't wait till I'm done my work and I can go play Zenith for a few hours. And it was more like, oh yeah, maybe I'll play Zenith tonight, that could be fun. Now that is the life cycle of pretty much all games, but it just happened a lot quicker with Zenith. As the weeks went on and I got to the max level, and was farming the end game gear with big groups of randos, I found myself playing less and less, and once I had that end game gear, I just kind of stopped for a while. It was still fun to log on and be part of these big random events farming end game content. Just being in the middle of a large group of people that are all sort of animated and moving around and talking to each other and motivated on a single goal, it really was a great experience. But nevertheless, I found myself playing less. A few months later, after taking a break, I logged back on, and sadly, my worst fears were sort of realized. Zenith did look pretty dead. There were a couple servers that during peak times would still reach the high population count, but it pretty much was just 2. One in US East and one in US West, and then I think there was one in Europe that would sometimes get to medium, but for the most part, all of these servers were pretty much empty. Now don't get me wrong, I still actually enjoy the core game loop of Zenith, you know, running around, and if you're an Essence Mage, shooting things with your Essence blasters, or if you're Blade Master going around and slashing things. I do think that is a fun thing to do, and even though it is a little bit repetitive, I do enjoy it. The core gameplay loop was still pretty fun. The combat, the gathering, the sort of being part of a big fantasy world in VR, and even occasionally running into another player. Sadly though, I think a large part of the magic of Zenith was that interacting with other players element, which is true for most MMOs. I mean, would you play World of Warcraft if it was single player? Probably not. Maybe some people would. Now, I know this isn't a particularly novel or interesting analysis just to say, oh, MMOs thrive when you have more people playing them, but I think it's especially noteworthy to point out for Zenith. I did have some IRL friends that played Zenith too, but they dropped it a lot quicker than I did. Perhaps I'm just stubborn. Recently, I was talking to one of them and their thoughts on why they didn't think Zenith was a very good game. During that conversation, I was thinking back to that first night of Zenith and thinking, of course Zenith is a good game. I had such a great time that first week, which led me to a bit of a deeper question of what we mean when we say a game is good. I think most of us play games to have a good time, but that sounds like it possibly is a different question. Is a game good if it facilitates a good time? Or are there some underlying features that are kind of independent of how much you enjoy a game that make a game good? Because if it's the former and you have a group of friends that you can play Zenith with, then by all means, no question asked, Zenith is a great game. Provided that everybody has a computer that is capable of playing it smoothly and you don't absolutely detest sort of the grindy loop of an MMO. Before this next part, I want to acknowledge that the quality of a game is entirely subjective. You thinking a particular game is good or bad is exactly as valid as someone else thinking that game is the opposite, provided that you've both actually tried the game. So for this next part, I'll just sort of be appealing to general cultural wisdom when it comes to the quality of games. Just to illustrate my point, you're welcome to substitute in your own examples if it makes it clearer for you. So thinking about a game as being good in and of itself and facilitating a good time sort of implies that there is a Punnett square in a sense of different types of games. So, you know, in one quadrant, there's a game that has the underlying features and like is a good game and also facilitates a good time. Then there's a game that has those features but does not facilitate a good time. And there's a game that doesn't have those features, so it's like not a good game, but it still facilitates a good time. And then there's a game that doesn't have those features and doesn't facilitate a good time. And I'm just for fun, I'm just gonna put down an example of each of those. So some of them I think are pretty easy. Like a good game that facilitates a good time might be something like Skyrim, right? A lot of people have played Skyrim for a really long time. A lot of people have really fond memories of Skyrim over the years, and most people would acknowledge it as sort of a masterpiece of the open world fantasy genre. Now, a bad game that doesn't facilitate a good time is also pretty easy. I would say that's something like, I've already used the example in this video, No Man's Sky at launch. I think that's an example of that. The game was very much not good, and the novelty of like 20 Brazilian Earth-like planets wore off pretty quickly when you realize they were all pretty much identical. Again, please check out No Man's Sky now, though. It really is an excellent game now. They really did, they put the work in. But at launch, I think it definitely belongs in that category. Now, a good game that doesn't facilitate a good time is a little bit harder to come up with, but I would propose something like Star Wars Battlefront 2, especially at launch. I mean the new one, not the old one. The old one's a masterpiece. Many among you may recall how poorly the launch went and how riddled with macro transactions the game was, and how pay to win it felt. Despite that, many of the most vocal critics would still say that the game itself is designed pretty well. The sound design was excellent, the graphics were very good, the gameplay was quite good, and they were all being completely ruined by this pay-to-win experience. Also, depending on the kind of gamer you are, I guess you could argue that something like Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy is like a good game that facilitates a bad experience, because while it's clearly like a well-designed game, everyone I know, myself included, every time they like stood up from a session of playing that game, they were like about to pop a blood vessel. So, you know, maybe that's part of the good experience though, I don't know, whatever. A bad game that does facilitate a good experience, many people might say Zenith. I mean, as much as I want to fanboy about this game, and fanboy I will, it's basically vanilla WoW with significantly fewer features, and that's not really where you need to be as an MMO in 2022. It's pretty buggy still, and the social feature, while better than launch for sure, still is not great. The gameplay, while novel and interesting for a little bit, does feel quite basic, but all of that being said, I still do enjoy the game. So that's why I think it might belong in this category. I personally am in the school of thought that as long as you're enjoying a video game, that's a good video game for you. I understand I'll need to bite a lot of bullets on like the logical consequences of that statement, and I am absolutely willing to do so as long as someone doesn't convince me otherwise. Despite this, I think the distinction of a good game versus a game that facilitates a good time actually does have some utility and is not meaningless at all. In particular, it's very helpful whenever you're trying to describe a game to someone else, like I am to you right now. All of this raises the question, does Zenith's many flaws preclude it from being a capital G good game? Well, I think that depends what you mean by a good game. Are you going to find a revolutionary story, world building, graphics, writing, balancing, game design, music? Okay, wait, the music actually does go really hard. The music is good. The music is good. Combat, visuals, dungeons, customization, or tactics in this game? No, you're not. Absolutely not. Are you going to be able to hop in with some friends and have a fantastic time though? Yes. Honestly, even if you don't have any friends that play VR, it might still be worth it just to go in by yourself for a bit. But I do strongly recommend joining a Discord or finding other people to play with because it's so much better, as every MMO is, with other people. So far in this video, we've talked about games like No Man's Sky and Elder Scrolls Online. Games that were kind of scuffed at launch, but have gotten significantly better over time. I am extending a little bit of optimism when I say this, but I do really think that Zenith might go in that direction. I think Ramen VR made a great accomplishment when they made Zenith the way they did. They broke into the VR MMO space. Regardless of how mid-tier any of the features I previously mentioned are, they really innovated here. And it's really impressive considering how novel everything is. Now, Ramen VR made a bunch of money during the Kickstarter, and they made a bunch of money at launch. Please hire me, Ramen VR. You seem like such a cool place to work, and I code all day for my thesis anyway, and I have hobbyist Unity experience. Please, I'll move anywhere. Their team seems really strong, although it might be stronger if you hire me, please. And I really have faith in their ability to turn Zenith from a promising proof of concept all the way up to an exceptional experience. And as VR hardware improves into the future, a lot of limitations that they may have had to work within right now will hopefully fade away. So allow me to do an analogy here. Imagine you're a chef and you're trying to invent something new. And let's say in this universe, chicken soup has never been invented, okay? You're trying to invent that. No one's done it before you. So you spend a bunch of time working on it, figuring out what to do. You have these chicken bones and you're like, oh, I'll try that. And the fact that you need to put it on high heat and that you use water in there instead of like I don't know, Four Loko, and all these things that nobody would ever think about because, I mean, we all already know what chicken broth is, but imagine a world where you didn't and you had to like figure it out from scratch, like what's chicken broth? And you have to spend a ton of time meticulously like make sure that you don't use Pepsi or something, right? You use water and you use bones and heat. I don't actually know how to make chicken broth. I think that's probably right though. So you spend a ton of time figuring all that out and then you serve it to people. But it's just broth. A lot of them will be super intrigued by this new salty chicken flavor. They'll enjoy it. You know, it's unlike anything they've ever eaten because chicken broth and chicken soup don't exist in this thought experiment. And in their current state, they might eat it a couple of times and then they'll be like, all right, you know, I'm not like craving like this just chicken broth on its own. And that's what I think Ramen VR has done with Zenith. They've shown us the broth and now we're all like, oh wow, that's like super cool and new and exciting. I look forward to seeing what future iterations of that will look like. And I am truly optimistic that Ramen VR will figure out how to add to the Zenith soup carrots, peas, corn, maybe some pepper and salt, maybe some noodles, maybe... What am I talking about again? So now comes the $1 million question. Or, I guess the 34 Canadian dollar question. Is it worth it to buy Zenith? So I'm sure you saw this coming, but I would say yes, with a caveat. If you're familiar with and or okay with the general MMO gameplay loop and okay with some things being unpolished, then I would say absolutely. Especially if you're able to bring friends with you. Not only will you get some super fun experiences now, but as Zenith continues to get updated, I truly believe it'll become even more of a VR historical cornerstone than it already is. I will now be rapid fire addressing some criticism that Zenith gets that I don't really like, and some praise that it gets that I just really don't think it's earned. And yes, I have heard all of these. Zenith isn't good. VR chat has way better social features and is a much better spot to hang out. Yeah, I agree. VR chat does have way better social features. Like I've said, Zenith's social features, they're improving, they're still not great. But while social features are a component of Zenith, that's obviously not the whole package. Some people enjoy a progression system in their game. If you truly don't care about that and literally just want to hang out with people, then by all means, yeah, VR chat's probably the better choice for you. But I think they kind of serve two different purposes, and it isn't really fair to compare them in that way. Zenith's combat is mid, and not as good as Blade and Sorcery. I'm gonna agree again, yeah, I mean, Zenith's combat is not as good as Blade and Sorcery's combat. The real weight on the swords, all of the magic physics and stuff like that in Blade and Sorcery, Blade and Sorcery is incredible at what it does. But again, that isn't really all Zenith tries to be. If someone managed to get the incredible swordplay and magic system from Blade and Sorcery and turn it into an MMO of the same scale as Zenith, then yeah, I mean, that would probably be the day that Zenith needs to adapt or die. But honestly, I don't see that happening in the next decade, right? It's gonna be a minute before we get something like that. Zenith is too unpolished. Township Tale is a better MMO. Yeah, Township Tale is pretty good. I've played it before Zenith came out. Similar to Zenith, I would have enjoyed it a lot more if I had a group of friends to consistently play with, but I really didn't. But at the end of the day, Township Tale is more of a VR Minecraft server in a sense. And don't get me wrong, I love a good Minecraft server, and I actually think Township Tale is a very good game. A lot of the crafting stuff is leagues ahead of Zenith, of course, as well as the polish in a lot of areas a lot better. And it's a very well thought out game, and the dev team seems to really care. I've been in their Discord for a while. But again, I think we can probably agree that Township Tale isn't really an MMO. Again, it's more of a Minecraft server with some friends, or randos. Okay, now let's talk about the other side. The bugs and repetitive combat are not an issue. Every MMO has it. Once again, I'll start out by saying yes, most MMOs have bugs and a very repetitive combat loop. It's almost intrinsic to the genre. That doesn't mean the degree to which Zenith takes that won't be an issue for many players. Look at a thriving MMO like Guild Wars 2 or Elder Scrolls Online. These games don't necessarily reach the same heights that you might see in a very good single-player game or even a non-MMO multiplayer game, but still have pretty high quality and intricate combat systems in my opinion. Now, before you yell at me in the comments, I 100% agree that it's not fair to compare Zenith to Guild Wars 2 or Elder Scrolls Online. Firstly, those are AAA studios. Zenith is an indie game. Secondly, those games have had over 10 years of development time, and Zenith has not had that. Also, not even to mention that they're both flat screen games and they don't face a lot of the same challenges that Zenith would in its development. That being said, saying a combat system that many players think is boring can't be improved just because it's in an MMO is sort of a false dichotomy in my mind. It certainly can be improved, not necessarily to the same level as those other games that I mentioned, but there's quite a big gap that it could occupy between those two, where it is now versus these top tier flat MMOs. In conclusion, Zenith is really fun, especially with friends. find some people to play with, don't take yourself too seriously, and just sort of enjoy the fantasy world. Before I finish, this discussion didn't include some things that many players may have issues with when it comes to Zenith. The biggest one that I can think of is accessibility. Now, Zenith is a VR game and as such has limitations in terms of its accessibility, especially since the two classes as of now, Essence Mage and Blade Master. Blade Master requires you to swing your swords a lot. Essence Mage requires you to sort of big gestures for your spells. The gliding requires you to sort of move your arms around like this a lot. And the climbing is like very vicious movements when you get going fast. Oh, by the way, I don't think I talked about the climbing or gliding at all in this. They're both pretty fun and very well done. VR gaming in general has a lot of accessibility issues that flat screen gaming may not have, but it definitely differs from some VR games to other VR games. In my opinion, if you don't have issues with a game like Beat Saber and you don't have issues with a game like Blade and Sorcery, then you'll have no issue with Zenith. That's all for this one. Tune in next time when I review the anti-war themes present in the campaign of Relic Games' 2003 masterpiece, Impossible Creatures. Or maybe it'll be another video where I just drop a breakable object on the ground. You never know with this channel. It's a bit of a grab bag. Join my Discord if you want to shout wacky video ideas at me. Link is in the description. All right, later.